at all. What better Jesus could there be than that? Now, of course, what Jesus looked like, I mean, in my book, I don't think that's really all that important. The Bible tells us very little. And to me, that seems to hint that there really wasn't anything particularly remarkable about his appearance. And even if Jesus had wings growing out of his back or 2 extra ears or something weird like that, I don't think that those things would make the actual physical appearance of Jesus all that important. What is important to me is that Jesus came in bodily, physical, human form. But really what I want to know is what kind of person Jesus is. Because that is what seems important to me. It gives me a window into the whole of what the divine is like, into the whole of what God is like. What is Jesus like? What a great gift we received from God when He sent His Son. Just so that, not only in salvation ways, but in learning what God is like by sending Him in human form. And this brings us to this story today, the first of our stories that we'll be looking at throughout this sermon. This brings us to this woman at the well in Samaria. And I wanted to start with this story because this woman is able to pick up on Jesus' nature very, very quickly. Maybe more quickly than anyone else does in the Bible. She zeroes in on Jesus' identity and persona faster than many people who are close followers, including the disciples sometimes. So what does this woman do right? And I want to know about what this woman does right because I want to try to do the same things. If we want to know what Jesus is like, we might be wise to start by seeing how people encounter Him and figure Him out. By the end of the story, Jesus for this woman goes from total stranger to the person who told her everything she's ever done. How does she grow to understand Him so quickly? Jesus, and so let's start by tracking her progress, because they do start out by total strangers, and this woman very quickly zeroes in on who Jesus is by the things that she says in the text. And so let's look at the text. Jesus asks the woman for a drink of water, and she replies, "Sir, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink of me?" So her first identification of Jesus is that He is a Jewish person. Now, we don't know how she knows this. Maybe people, at that time who were from Judea dressed in a certain way or had a certain accent in the way that they spoke compared to Samaria. But somehow she knows that He's a Jew. So that's her first identification. And she wonders aloud, but then it very quickly moves on. Because the next time she speaks, she wonders aloud whether this Jew, Jesus, could be greater than one of the very great Jews of history. She wonders aloud if he is greater than their ancestor, Jacob. So she goes quickly from understanding that he is a Jew to a very special Jewish person. And then next the dialogue continues, and she figures out a little more and declares, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet." And so she keeps zeroing in closer and closer, getting closer to the identity of Jesus as they continue to have this short conversation. He's a prophet. He's a very special person. And finally, this woman brings up the M word. She tells Jesus that she knows about the coming Messiah, not quite asking Him or declaring Him to be the Messiah, but she kind of hints at it. She wonders whether He is. And Jesus declares Himself to be what she might be wondering about. Now at this point the disciples get back, and of course they spoil the conversation because they do that sometimes. But in this very short conversation, Jesus goes from being a stranger from Judea to the Messiah for this woman. And so how does she get so far so fast? How many times do we see this in the Bible? It's very rare. And I think there are some characteristics about her and her attitude that really help her. First, the woman in this story is willing to open herself up to Jesus. She's willing to share with Him in conversation. And she, in many ways, makes herself vulnerable to Him. I mean, consider the circumstances of this conversation, that it's even happening. This woman is a part of a group that Jews don't socialize with. They don't associate themselves with. Now that's remarkable on Jesus' part, but Samaritans didn't particularly like Jews either, mostly because of the ways that they shunned the Samaritans. It wouldn't have been surprising if he spoke to her and she just turned around and walked away, scared or angry or frightened. And yet right off the bat, the woman engages in conversation with Jesus. She's open to what he has to say. Furthermore, let's consider this. This is a man talking to a woman who isn't her relative in public. That's also pretty taboo in this time period that this story is taking place. This conversation is even happening is remarkable. And this woman is open to Jesus' words. This is true all the more so when Jesus brings up her 4 husbands. Now that's a pretty probing, or 5 husbands. That's a pretty probing remark, isn't it? Especially for a stranger to tell you. And by modern standards, we might even think it's a little bit rude. And yet the woman keeps talking and keeps opening herself up to Jesus and what he has to say. There's a level of trust building, or of curiosity building, or something. I don't really know quite what. But this woman is open to it. If the woman is willing to open herself up, her full self, to Jesus, then she's also willing to let Jesus bend her expectations of him. And gradually, he's able to move past those expectations. In other words, the second thing we can learn from this woman is that she doesn't keep Jesus in a box. She's willing to let her understanding of Jesus grow past her mindset. Now, I think this is the biggest problem that messes other people up in the Bible, and it messes people up today too. Because from the disciples to the Pharisees to even Pilate and so many others, all the time people meet Jesus. He seems to share something special with them. And yet they aren't willing to let him go beyond their expectations of him. And so they get confused or angry or scared, and they leave without experiencing what Jesus wants them to experience. But this isn't the case with this woman. She's not willing to let her preconceptions define who Jesus is. In fact, throughout the conversation, if you look closely, you see that Jesus keeps tiptoeing past her expectations. And he's not just a Jew. He's not just greater than Jacob. He's not just a prophet. He's not just the Messiah. He's a person who told her everything she's ever done. And nowhere along the way does she stop him with the roadblocks that others do so often. Later in the summer, we're going to look at the story of Nicodemus, which takes place in the previous chapter. And he's this Pharisee who comes to Jesus at night, and he has this great conversation with Jesus. But he's not willing to open his mind to what Jesus wants to share with him beyond what he already thinks he knows about Jesus. And so the conversation ends with confusion instead of joy. This woman is willing to let Jesus define himself and be open to how he does so. Well, that's an easy thing to think about in the Bible from a story a long time ago. But when you think about how that might apply to our own lives, it gets a little bit uncomfortable. When it's happening to the Samaritan woman, it's laudable. It's something that we want to pat her on the back for. But when Jesus shows up, at least in my own life, and points out a few ways in which I've kept him boxed up in my own preconceptions, I'm not always as happy about it. It's good for all of us to constantly be asking ourselves, have I come to know who Jesus is? Or have I made Jesus into what I want him to be? And this can get us in a lot of trouble in all sorts of ways. Anne Lamott, who's a great writer, once wrote that you can safely assume that you have created God in your own image when it turns out that he hates all the same people you do. The Samaritan woman doesn't put Jesus inside a box. She lets Jesus redefine what the box's boundaries are and even does away with those boundaries altogether. Finally, we can learn from the woman because once she encounters Jesus and realizes who he is, she invites others to encounter him as well. And I think that's an important step along the way. She has experienced something that has been challenging and meaningful and healing and maybe even reorienting. And her first reaction is to go back to her village and tell people about it. I mean, sometimes we think about sharing our faith as if it is something that's uncomfortable or awkward, and I understand that. I am there myself. But one of the things that we see in this story is that God's transformative love, when it comes to fruition in a person's life, invites a desire to share that love and that message with others. I'm as uncomfortable as anybody about sharing my faith, at least in an evangelistic sort of way. And yet, this story seems to hint that if I want to experience the transformative love of Jesus Christ most fully, somewhere along the way I have to turn to my neighbor and say, hey, come and meet the man who told me everything I've ever done. That message deserves to be shared. And as we experience Christ in the weeks ahead, I hope that all of us will feel more comfortable doing the same. Let us pray.